So I'm here to talk about the role of the CIO in driving this Canadian digital innovation to what Neil described. And when you look at uh, the environment today, or where we're situated, even considering things like we're amongst a global pandemic, consider this: the shift in the way the enterprise now works includes embracing new roles and responsibilities of the chief information officer. Once seen as a cost cutter, service delivery manager, and gatekeeper in fighting email spam, has certainly expanded exponentially to embrace business strategy. For example, by re-engineering processes, driving revenue through the analysis of data, and assessing risk associated to cybersecurity. This change in the CIO role goes hand in hand with the fourth revolution, in which AI, robotics, big data, and software embedded in supply chains is changing the way we do business globally. And so the CIO Strategy Council came together and brings together the country's most forward-thinking public, private, and not-for-profit sector CIOs and executive tech leaders. Its purpose is to converge on common digital priorities and to take collective action. Our members are innovators in their organizations, embracing change, and really about driving the adoption of Canadian technologies. Together, essentially with chief information officers, chief technology officers, chief data officers, chief digital transformation officers, that C-suite of executive tech leaders coming together and tackling some of the leading questions surrounding technology innovation. For example, most recently, the council met to discuss vaccine credentials in relation to those that can, those receiving a test and or receiving a vaccine. How do we effectively ensure that these individuals are in fact vaccinated to further advance our ability as an economy to reopen safely? Most recent conversations also talked about solving the AI challenge, the adoption challenge, where there is certainly learning and awareness, and where you have organizations on various parts of the spectrum, from leading in AI to those that are still trying to determine where and which AI can be applied in their respective organizations. And so by bringing CIOs and tech leaders together to have these critical conversations around the most pressing public policy issues of our time, and to really shape collective action in solving for to remain competitive globally, is exactly why the CIO Strategy Council was formed, and to help solve those challenges. So in terms of what we do, we really dedicate ourselves to creating this integrated ecosystem, where in which we can then hone Canada's global leadership and competitiveness in a global economy. We're providing access to a trusted peer group for mutual support and interaction and learning, and wherein each member organization can go about transforming their respective organizations. And this too, where they're able to shape their vendor landscape and influence the Canadian digital ecosystem. Consider this: you have chief information officers that are making decisions in relation to the technologies they procure and adopt within their organizations. The influence these CIOs have in the overarching technology architecture within their organizations is pivotal to the competitiveness of each of these organizations. And so by bringing CIOs together and collectively converging on not only common digital priorities, but also to converge on the technical architectures and the standards associated to which we embed responsible technologies into our organizations, can send that signal to the marketplace as to the expectations of products, services, and people. And so through strategic leadership, standards and technology, and looking at skills and talent, the CIO Strategy Council and its chief information officers and tech leaders are accelerating research, policy, and solution development in key areas for ICT, advancing standardization to ensure that those signals to the marketplace are such that certainly our member organizations and companies don't need to buy the same thing, but they can definitely inform what the expectation of those products and services are, and to which they would then procure, and to leverage that lever that we'll get into a little bit later. And certainly with the future of work and the changing dynamic, not only with the role of the CIO, but with the way in which automation and AI are influencing the type and the sorts of work that we're engaged in, we are looking at skills and talent and how to effectively ensure the competencies and qualifications of those future leaders in these critical positions to ensure, again, that our Canadian digital ecosystem is strong, is competitive to global counterparts, and provides seamless services, digital services, to clients, customers, and in the case of governments, to citizens. I want to really hone in on shaping marketplace rules and shaping vendor behaviors associated to the types of technologies that are created and then consumed by organizations and or by citizens in their own right. We are Canada's only tech-focused accredited standard development organization. And I'll get a little bit more into this and in terms of what that means and how it applies in the application of emerging technologies and having those technologies adopted within organizations. Our accreditation from Standards Council of Canada is they're a Crown Corp reporting into the Minister of Innovation, Economic Development. And it's a testament to the rigor in our standards development process. And it essentially authorizes the CIO Strategy Council to develop national standards of Canada. And we particularly have a focus on advancing standards that help support to advance Canada's digital economy. The important piece with respect to the accreditation that needs to be recognized is that the way in which a standard is developed, the very approach that is used, the openness or consensus-based approach, is something that not all standards are equal. And so not only is the standard as important to shape marketplace rules and marketplace behaviors, but so too is the very process to have inherent trust in the type of standard that's been created. And so with Standards Council of Canada accreditation, we essentially open up our process to Standards Council to look under the hood and ensure that ultimately the standards that we are creating are in compliance with the World Trade Organization requirements, as well as with Standards Council of Canada requirements around the development of standards for the Canadian ecosystem. We also, as much as we're accredited here in Canada in developing national standards, we are facilitating a very important role globally. We are a founding member of Oceanus, the Open Community for Ethics in Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. And this group is a collaboration amongst standard setting bodies around the world, because we're cognizant that, especially when it comes to things like data knows no borders. And the way in which we govern it and the way in which we apply it within AI, so too is the same. And so this coordination with standard setting bodies from around the world is helping to address and to serve as a conduit, as a forum to effectively solve for extraordinary challenges facing ICT globally, and not only here at home. And with us as a founding member and most recently appointed the Secretariat, and I serve as the chair of Oceanus, we are in a position to help shape the global coordination amongst standard setting bodies and industry groups to ensure that consensus as well as harmonization and alignment is created in such a way that responsible technologies aren't only embedded here at home, but around the world, and wherein Canadian technologies can serve the global market, and we can further export our technologies internationally that meet Canadian interests and align with Canadian standards that are fit for global use that are developed by the CIO Strategy Council. To give a sense of our standard setting difference, there's an infographic here that articulates the key principles associated to the development of standards. It articulates the process from start to finish with respect to any new standard that is proposed. Important to note that any stakeholder can come to the CIO Strategy Council, tap on our shoulder and say, hey, I have a need for a standard for X. And then an evaluation ensues. Of that. You do not need to be a member of the CIO Strategy Council to engage in the standard setting exercise. It is open by default. Any stakeholder can engage at any point in time within the development of any particular standard. There's full transparency. These standards are available, readily available on the web, easy to access, and comments can be made by any stakeholder associated to any of the drafts. So, you have your drafts available 24/7, 365 days a year, 366 if you're in the leap year. So there's full transparency. It's an agile process. It's about taking an iterative approach to standardizing emerging technologies. These are areas that are, quite frankly, in flux. And when you look at responsible technology deployment, you're asking some very hard critical questions about how you govern the data, how you share the data, how do you ultimately store and archive the data and or delete it? How do you go about ensuring somebody is who they say they are and providing that you have all the information you need and what information you need to make such a dissertation? And so this agile process is such that with these emerging technologies and a way to standardize, we're very much looking at a process in which we continually iterate upon the standard to further improve it, but at the same time providing a signal in the marketplace as to the expectations at a given time associated to these technologies. It's a way in which we can go to market quickly through an agile process to ensure that ultimately these technologies are being built with ethics in mind, with privacy, with cybersecurity, et cetera, et cetera. It's a consensus-based approach. Every stakeholder, and it's a multi-stakeholder approach to participation where diverse interest groups come together and ultimately are all essentially eligible to vote, subject to conflict of interest rules. There's no cap size with respect to the technical committee. It's not as though it's a committee of 20 that have voting rights and the rest are serving as guests or observers. This is an opportunity for any Canadian to engage in the process, whether you come from industry, whether you're within academia, whether you're in government, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're a civil society member, whether you're a mother or a father. Any stakeholder can engage in this process and effectively help shape the way in which we expect what we expect of products and services and of people when it comes to these emerging technologies. Further, these standards are current and readily available. Given that we are talking about transforming the digital economy, we're converging on common digital priorities. We are shaping the landscape in such a way that we can further compete globally here in Canada. These standards ultimately are help serve as a roadmap or as a tool in the toolbox for organizations to effectively shape not only their vendor landscape, but also to shape their rules and practices, policies, and procedures with respect to the way in which they're designing and deploying technologies. And so as such, and given that we're talking about the way in which we govern data, the way in which we use AI, the way in which we ensure we're cyber safe, all of these standards in the national interest are available at no cost for stakeholders to readily use consensus-based deliverables from experts across multiple fields, across sectors, to be able to further advance their own digital transformation. And similarly, given that it's an emerging field and emerging technologies, these are standards that are current. Typical practice in traditional standard setting is you open the document 5 years later and have a look at to see whether or not there's any changes that need to be made. In the CIO Strategy Council process, given that we're talking about technologies that are evolving, that are changing, any standard that is published, it's reviewed within no later than, the start of the review is no later than a year from the time that we open it up and have another look. So in turn, those areas, and I alluded to many of them, and I'll get into a sense of where currently these national standards are currently governing part of the way in which stakeholders can leverage and organizations can use. We're developing national standards in data governance, digital identity, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and more. And these standards play a critical role because they're not only Canadian based, but they're fit for global use. Here's an example of 5 document standards that are currently available in market that organizations can readily adopt and use within their internal practices. They can use within their procurement as the expectation, again, on what products and technologies they consume as an organization. And so please feel free to download at your convenience. In addition, we have a number of standards in development. It's an opportunity for organizations and stakeholders to engage in the process of helping to set standards, for example, for the de-identification of data, for health data, the way in which we go about the responsible collection and use of contact tracing within organizations. As much as there's the public health side and technologies that are effectively helping serve with public health within an organization in the workplace and an employer's responsibility to the safety of their workers, it's quite another thing. And in turn, having the appropriate guidance and minimum requirements associated to how I collect and use digital contact tracing and monitoring data in the workplace becomes critical, especially when we're looking to further reopen our places of business as another tool in the toolbox to reopen safely. And then again, a number of other standards associated to cybersecurity, associated to built environments, etc. So I want to close on this piece around how standards can influence marketplace behaviors. It's important to recognize, as much as I said earlier, standards can not only help shape marketplace rules and shape these behaviors, but also what standards, ultimately standards can come from multiple different sources. You can have standards within industry that are developed, industry associations, governments to their own effect may develop standards. You have accredited standard development organizations, you have regional and international standards bodies as well, where you have member countries representing their country and coordinate expertise to participate in and shape these international standards. What's important to note, though, is that the process of each and that all standards aren't treated equal. The very process in which standards are developed is just as important as the standard itself in terms of the requirements it contains within. If you have an open, consensus-based process that represents diverse interests, there's much more inherent trust in those mechanisms than there is if it's solely a standard based on specific interests. And so the way in which standards can be used can influence marketplace rules. You have a number of levers available to you, and whether you're coming from the government side, the academia, or the private sector side, I want to get into some of those key levers that are available to you on the use of standards. And this, again, is all centered around how standards not only shape marketplace behaviors, but that ultimately there is levers that can influence these behaviors, and you have a number that you're using on a day-to-day basis that ultimately, by intersecting both these levers with standards, you can create a catalyst for change and for responsible technology deployment. These include things like regulation. Ultimately, standards can be incorporated by reference in a regulation, where in which once a voluntary standard becomes mandatory by virtue of it being regulated. What's important to note, as I mentioned with respect to the process in which standards are developed, being just as important as the standard itself, in cabinet directives here in Canada, associated to the creation of regulation, regulatory objectives that regulators have ultimately need to be assessed against whether or not there are existing standards in the marketplace, international, regional, or national, that serve to meet that regulatory objective. And if it does, then a question and analysis associated to whether or not you need to regulate, or you simply point to that standard, and or if you incorporate it by reference and in case making it law. So it's important to note when regulators are making those decisions, how the standard was created in the first place becomes just as important as the document itself. In addition, you have case law. There are a number of instances where you have standards that are referenced in case law, and as a result become de facto the standard that the way of operating. This of course ultimately coming when something went wrong. And if you have a really savvy lawyer that is able to pinpoint a consensus-based standard that's in the market that serves as a tool in the toolbox associated with how an organization either conducts itself and or the technologies in which are consumed and used and interacted with, standards can be referenced in the case of where something went wrong. And in turn, an organization demonstrating it having done due diligence. This is where standards become critical. You have supply chain, insurance, public recognition, tax breaks, subsidies, grants, procurement, and research. These are all different types of policy levers and regulatory levers that are at your disposal. Some within the public sector, others within the private and not-for-profit sectors. If you take procurement, for example, procurement has, or purchasing, you are stating what you need. You're stating the challenge that ultimately needs to be solved for. You can point to standards in terms of what your expectations are on these products and services before you in fact consume them within your organization. In addition, as part of that procurement process, you can test against those solutions to ensure that they in fact meet a standard. And whether that's by virtue of you having a look and creating it as part of the condition in terms of procuring that product or solution that you ultimately have tested against, something to ensure that you are getting what you expect. Or you could look at avenues in which a product or solution or technology has been certified by a third party to provide that independent assurance associated to the way in which an organization and or the technology meets the requirements in a standard. And so these are all different levers that are at your disposal. The last one that I'll just touch on is with respect to grants, and this can come from public and private sector as well. Again, this is a lever that can be pulled associated to receiving of dollars associated with evolving a technology or creating or helping to solve a solution and ensuring that the technologies that are used are in fact responsible. You again, as part of these as part of the selection process, can incorporate standards as to the expectations on the way in which these technologies are in fact being created and deployed to serve the purpose associated to whatever the grant application is. So again, and to conclude on all of this and to take some of your questions, of course, I just want to note that with respect to the Chief Information Officer role, a couple things. One, the role is changing significantly, exponentially changing from keeping the lights on to much more of a business enabler. And it's not just the Chief Information Officer. Every individual within an organization has a role to play with respect to how the organization competes, how effectively it provides services and products to customers, consumers, or citizens in the case of governments. And each of you have a critical role to play when it comes to influencing marketplace behaviors and the rules associated. And one tool that chief information officers around the world have been using and executive tech leaders has been standards. And in Canada, through the CIO Strategy Council, we have a national forum bringing together leading chief information officers, executive tech leaders to converge on common digital priorities and take collective action. And one way in which we do that to further shape vendor landscapes and to ensure that products and services and people are meeting the intended expectations of what we would come to expect in terms of responsible, privacy preserving, cyber secure type solutions in the marketplace. This is where standardization can play a critical role and the associated certification to those standards. And so for everybody here today, I want to thank you for your time, and I do want to encourage all of you with respect to these standards and emerging technologies, associated data governance, AI, IoT, big data, the list goes on. And quite frankly, we need you. We need you to share your expertise, your experience, and help shape the future economy and help ensure that digital transformation efforts are done in such a way that are responsible, and that the technologies ultimately deployed are responsible, and that we can accelerate the adoption of these technologies with certainty associated with the types of expectations that we have on these products and services through requirements that are drafted within national standards and international standards and the like. And so with that, I will open it up for some